have Steve Wozniak, better known as Woz, to come and talk to us.
So yeah, it's quite a life. I always was shy and never wanted any attention, and now it's like so busy as it was being explained. And my assistant you were talking to is actually my goddaughter who just graduated from college, and she wanted to come work for me as my assistant. Her mother was my area associate, my assistant at Apple Computer way back when. I was a little different type of a person who's kind of known as an executive. I would never be an executive because I'm just a techie type, fun with electronics person at heart. So I insisted that every phone call that came into Apple had to come right to my phone. Nobody takes a call for me, that sort of thing. I've had a lot of relationship with schools, and I grew up with strong education values, and it largely came from my father, made me proud to be a young student who was going to make the world better than our parents had, and for some reason we never quite do. But it's a good story. And I got close to my schools. I've got media centers named after me in the local district, and I realized giving computers is like giving money, and that's easy, and it doesn't mean that much. You should really give yourself. So I went and I taught 5th graders, I taught 6th through 9th graders, and I taught teachers. I was working almost every day teaching for 8 years, and just did it quietly out of the press because it's something I believed in. I didn't want to write a book or do a CD like Apple wanted me to do, and reach out and train other people, because I want to work one-on-one with individuals that you can go to their college graduation someday and say, I helped that person in their life in some way. It's very difficult to go back and do the things that you were meant to do, that you had intended to do, that you would have done without the success of Apple. When something huge like Apple happens, you tend to become some big, investor mogul and, with tons of money, and money's the rest of your life, and maximizing it and running projects and that sort of thing. And I was a person who had told my dad in 6th grade that someday I wanted to be an engineer like he was, but my second goal was to be a 5th grade teacher. And how do you go back to those early goals? You have to have a very strong independent mind. I'm going to be myself, I believe in myself, I'm going to do those sort of things. Along those lines, I'm the only one of the people that started all these personal computer companies, like Bill Gates and Paul Allen and Steve Jobs and myself, Larry Ellison, all these people dropped out of college, and went to, start businesses. It was so interesting and intriguing, and truthfully, most of your education in the world doesn't really come from the classroom. It kind of comes from talking to people and learning how certain businesses are done, most of the things that help you, but I believe strongly in education. So I actually went back, and I'm the one who went back and got my college degree. I went back to Berkeley. I had 1 year left to go. I wasn't really a dropout. And I went under a fake name, so they wouldn't recognize me because Apple had been sort of a big success story. And I used the name Rocky Raccoon Clark at Berkeley. So my EE and CS diploma says Rocky Raccoon Clark. And does anyone in here use PCs? Have you heard about our zero tolerance policy? Since we're in a school. Humor aside, I like to make up jokes everywhere I go. One of the latest ones I made up, that I was just in Greece, and I could tell you a few I made up there, but I'll skip those. And one of my made up was, what do you call a fish salesman? I was just driving the car 2 days ago. Yeah, what do you call a fish salesman? A sole proprietor. So life should, you should be able to go through life and have it be very entertaining. One point in my life I thought, well, at the end of your life, and there's somebody who ran companies and made sure every little piece was in order, and I saw a few adults that were like this, always talking about how they arranged everything to work so perfectly. And I thought, then there's other guys that are just like, maybe on the street, maybe they don't have any money, they're just running around, they're laughing with their friends, telling jokes, they're always smiling. Who had the better life on the day you die? It's how many times did you smile in your life versus how many times did you frown? And we often fool ourselves into thinking we'll get there. For example, we develop technology because we believe, and this is stuff my father taught me, we believe that technology will give us a better life and more free time and more happiness in the end. And really, when you look back, do we have more smiles than, say, the caveman had? My hunch is they were just as happy as in existence as we were. maybe even happier. I think, part of the deal is the formula of too much population for resources, and they had more to go around, I guess. So we don't really get there, but something inside of us makes us curious and creative and inventive. And we want to do these things. We want to create new and different ways and study the atoms and learn how they work and try to make things that never existed before. And we wouldn't have been created as human beings with this desire unless there were some end goal. So we have to tell ourselves the end goal is we are getting to that great happy state. I grew up in Silicon Valley, and it was all fruit orchards. Just as far as you could see, trees and orchards. Very few houses out in Sunnyvale. And it was a very pleasant area. It was called Santa Clara Valley, and we were the largest fruit producer in the world in some categories of fruits. And William Shockley moved to Mountain View. He was one of the inventors of the transistor at AT&T. Came to Mountain View and set up Shockley Laboratories. Worked so hard. He was so narrow-minded and focused on one type of transistor that would totally revolutionize the phone companies of the world. But it was a 4-layer transistor, and as hard as they tried, they couldn't make it in the silicon reliably back then. So a bunch of his engineers left to make a real normal transistor, and they formed companies like Fairchild and Rheem and Raytheon that were making the early transistors. And my father moved us to Sunnyvale, and he worked at Lockheed. And he was a very brilliant engineer and very renowned for coming up with guidance solutions that nobody else could come up with. So he had a very closeness to the companies supplying the materials used in particularly missiles that were launched. And in those days, missiles cost a huge amount of money. We were building, the most advanced rockets there were, but in rockets in those days, every fraction of a gram amounted to thousands of dollars that it cost to launch it to wherever it was going. So he came home one day and he was showing structures of tons of little dinky tiny transistors, almost without any plastic cases, strung on little strings of metal wires going up and down this thing. And then he explained pretty soon they were going to make these silicon parts called chips. And the chips that they were going to make would have like 6 transistors on one chip. And the most wonderful product I'd ever owned in my life, maybe to this day, was my first transistor radio. Held it in my hand, a little blue radio, 6 transistors. They were made in Japan back then. I could sleep with it all night long listening to music. It became so important in my life, music did. And I told my father, I said, wow, they're going to make 6 transistors on a chip so they can make a better transistor radio. And he said, well, no, the world doesn't quite work that way. It's really for the military. And then after a while, they're too expensive for any people for transistor radios. And after a while, the fallout parts, the surplus, the older stuff that's been passed by is what people get for their normal products in their home. But I felt, doggone it, the appliances in the home are how we make life better. That's what, being an inventor, being an engineer, that's what it's all about. It's making appliances for the normal Joe in the normal home. And these transistor radios should be rated as important, and driving the technology. And I always had this in the back of my mind. And after a certain point in time, it was personal computers were pushing the state of the art for the largest chips being made, right? And nowadays, what is it? It's games pushing the most advanced, highest processing chips being made. So it's kind of a little bit humorous that we sort of got there. Back in those days, when I was in elementary school, early chips would cost $50 for a chip with 6 transistors. One little dinky gate that if you put in 2 signals, you got 1 out. That would cost $50. Back then, it's like $500 today. Who could ever afford one? You could never build a computer out of them in the early days of chips. I was lucky to have an electronics aptitude. My parents didn't push us in any one direction. My dad was such a good teacher. He just pretty much let us go out in the world, discover what we liked, and then help us get to what we wanted to be, find our own goals. And I put that into practice in my own life. But I discovered a manual in the garage in the hallway one afternoon. And I started going through this journal, a journal that was very rare. You'd never see anything talking about computers in a store. You'd never see an article about computers in the newspaper. Once in a while, you'd get a glimpse of these huge machines that filled up rooms, and you'd hear the story of it. And I guess eventually the IBM 704 was a machine that in today's dollar cost $25 million, and they sold 20,000 of them. When you multiply those numbers together, you realize why IBM is such a big company. That IBM 704 really was an amazing machine, but I didn't think computers were really in the world. I thought they existed in some strange places that some universities must have called research centers. Or maybe the computers existed in the military, you know. You'd never really see one or touch one in your life. Here was a journal with articles describing ones and zeros. And I learned that, you know, 1, 0, 1 is equivalent to 5. So I like to look at my digital watch. My other one broke on a trip I was just on in Greece. All I had was a digital watch, and I can see that it's roughly 7:15 to 30-ish, closer to 30. I just know how to read the bits, you know, but it's 111, that's 7 o'clock for the hours, and 11100 for the minutes is 28. So I learned this stuff, and I thought, wow, in 5th grade, you haven't had any of the advanced mathematics of, you know, you haven't had algebra, you haven't had trigonometry, you haven't had geometry, you haven't had calculus, you haven't had differential equations, you haven't had all that stuff. Computer science in people's minds was further away than rocket science. And yet here it was ones and zeros, so easy to understand. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. The numbers all doubling were the key to it. I could understand this in 5th grade, and I thought, wow, I've stumbled on something that I love, that I can do, that's easy, even for a 5th grader. Didn't, you know, none of the other 5th graders do it. It made me kind of special for a shy kid. And read these articles, and then they talked about logic gates, little tiny devices. You could draw a circuit on a piece of paper, and what it meant was the signals came in as ones and zeros, and they came out as ones and zeros by some formula, some logic. And it was easy to understand. You could actually look at this and learn it all. Every type of logic diagram that's drawn, you could learn it all in half an hour and understand it and be able to write some ones and zeros on papers and play with it and prove to yourself. And you could do this in 5th grade. What an amazing discovery. And I decided almost the first day I saw this journal, computers were my one love and interest in life. Of course, I would never use a computer or see one or touch one. Engineers always design things like, I even thought this through high school. Engineers designed radios and televisions and guidance systems and computers. I don't know who designs computers. Some weird people work on them. It's theoretical, but I loved it. I read an article about a round tube like a television, and the beam comes out and turns on the little dots of a television. They were phosphors. And then another beam could actually sense, is it on or is it off? And then refresh it. And it was like a memory. They used those as memories, as dynamic memories. What an incredible article to read and learn this stuff. Somewhere inside, they had an algebra, and they taught how you can take one type of equation using ands and change it to one using ors. And it's like you can make the same statement in different ways in English. You know, if John and Mary both come. But you could say, if John doesn't come or Mary doesn't come, then they didn't both come. That you can change the wording around from ands to ors, and I learned how to do this, and wow, it was my mathematical skill, and I was so special, more special than the other kids in the class. My inspirations for electronics largely came from reading books called Tom Swift Jr. And he was a young engineer, owned his own company with his father, and so he could just fly around the world with his friends, and whenever there was a world crisis, he'd go into the laboratory and hook some circuits together and work for weeks and build something. The solution was always building things. And it might be a submarine, it might be a spacecraft, it might be a plasma field that could hold an alien presence and communicate with it. And boy, I just admired that so much. That's sort of like the hero in books. And that sends you in a direction in life. Read one book about a ham radio group. They could actually type Morse code on these keys and send signals to another neighborhood, to another city, to another state. Wow, that's like, they were supermen. You can actually communicate to other states with this radio thing. At the end of the book, it said, anybody of any age can be a ham radio operator. So at 10 years old, I sent in, got the books and studied, and I got a ham radio license. Ham radio, back then, the days of vacuum tubes, when, you know, the TVs, when the TV broke down, even the kids, the husband, the wife could pull out the tubes of a TV set, put them in a brown bag, and take them down to the grocery store. And in the back of the grocery store was a little machine. You'd dial some numbers for this 3V5 tube, you know, and put it in the right socket, and the meter would go red or green, and you figure out which tube is bad, come home and replace them. I mean, those were the days when we had access to the technology, you know, that went good and bad, and could understand the little pieces of it. Well, my ham radio, my parents gave me incredible thing, a transmitter and a receiver kit. They came as kits, they were pieces that came in a box. Metal plates, metal enclosures, tube sockets that you'd have to bolt into place and then solder all the wires and the resistors and the capacitors. How fun it was to learn codes on resistors. And there were other little kids in my neighborhood, the electronics kids. A lot of us had engineers for friends. I was in a new neighborhood, tons and tons of kids. Almost every house had kids. And we all loved sharing the fact that we knew the color codes on resistors. A red is a 2, and an orange is a 3, and a green is a 5. And so this was our thing. We would do gardening work for the neighborhood people, and instead of being paid with money, we'd ask to look at their parts, and they'd have all these mayonnaise jars. Every garage had mayonnaise jars full of parts, and we'd look at them. I want some of those, and some of those, and some of those. And that's how we would take our pay. It's just, we loved it. Not that we could use it for anything, not that it had a value to us, other than this meant something. It was part of my life because we had learned about it, and we would read Popular Electronics magazines once in a while, save enough allowance to take our bikes down to Sunnyvale Electronics, buy a few of these parts, and come back home and build something that, made sounds or did some simple little job, made a light flash at a certain rate. So that was fun. We had the electronics kids, I call ourselves. One time, my friend down the block, Bill Werner, talked a phone man into giving us a spool of phone wire. A whole coil, big coil of it. So we ran it on the fences from his house to mine. And then we ran down, we bought carbon microphones and batteries and speakers, and we got it to where I could call him up and then eventually design this beautiful little thing. I wanted to be the most beautiful thing in my life, so I drew every line in my design as straight as I could, pictures of where the switches would go in colors, and a little device I could turn a light on in his room and wake him up at 4 in the morning so we could go out and toilet paper a house or whatever do, let us set off firecrackers. I could sound a buzzer, or I could talk to him. We had house-to-house intercom. We ran the wire over the street, over to Greg Angel's house, all the way up the block to Stephen Delatour's, and then it went dead. And turns out one of the neighbors had cut the wire in about 20 places. We kids just thought, there's a fence, you run a wire on it. We hadn't thought, oh, people kind of own things. You just don't think of what's, arbitrary and man-made. So we reran the wire on the other side of the fence so that neighbor couldn't cut it. And it was a fun time growing up and knowing a little bit of electronics. We were a special group. We were pretty much nerds in school. We were outsiders, bit on the shy side. We'd have our own group. And whatever the group was, for some reason, I was always the leader, deciding where we ride our bikes, what project we do today. So I had a leadership role, and I never wanted really to be a follower. I didn't even want to just go to church and say the same words as everyone else. I wanted to think out what's right and wrong for myself. I wanted to come up with, I really believed that I had a good mind. Didn't want to ever touch drugs. I've never taken an illicit substance because I didn't want to affect my mind. And if somebody said, oh, this drug will make you better, or think clearer, and see parts of yourself, well, I wouldn't want to be myself plus an enhancement. I want to be myself through life. I had a good brain and wanted to use it. I was a top student, would get the math awards in my junior high school and my high school, and electronics awards and that sort of thing, and electronics genius. But an outsider, not in the social groups. I didn't want to go to the parties because I thought, here are all these kids, and they go to a party, and they wind up drinking or whatever. And this was in the 60s. And they're doing it because all their friends are doing it. If it's the right thing to do, you would do it on your own with nobody else around. And being with only doing it because other people are doing it. I never wanted to be that type. I wanted to be, I don't care what everybody else is doing. I want to do things my own way. Well, in high school, I had some amazing science fair projects in 5th grade, huge ones, the ones that take weeks to build, hundreds of parts, switches, lights, diodes. Then it moved up to hundreds of transistors to make a machine that could play tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe is a game of logic. If you played every game of tic-tac-toe on a piece of paper, white paper, pull out some white paper, you could play every possible variation of the game in a day or two. And you could start making up sets of rules. Number the squares of tic-tac-toe 1 to 9, and you could make up rules such as if square 1 has an X and square 3 has an X, and square 2 is not taken, I will take square 2. It's a set of rules. Every one of those rules turns out to be one logic gate that takes one transistor and a few little decisions as to what things are on or off. coming into it. So it was very easy. What I did was I pounded hundreds of nails into a piece of plywood and just soldered transistors and diodes and resistors to all those things and made one little gate for every one of my tic-tac-toe rules. And it's a huge project, and really building huge projects when you're that young, I think helps a lot if you're going to go into engineering. Another time I built a project with hundreds of transistors that could actually add numbers. I described the ones and zeros. Those are the numbers of computers. We humans made a horrible mistake, which is when we started the numbering system, we didn't really know how nature works. We didn't really know how logic was going to work, so we based our numbers on 10. And scientists in Europe like to talk about the metric system. It's all based on tens. Well, it turns out that one half, up until about 5 years ago, one half of all of the computing power in the world was being used to convert between base 10 and base 2, the numbers of computers. One half of the processing power, and that might not be true with games, but it certainly is true with anything with finances. And we should have really picked a numbering system that's based on 8s or 16s. Those are magic computer numbers. I kind of try to be a computer purist in these sort of senses. Computer purists and programmers like to know that number counting systems always start with 0, whereas human beings want to start with 1. Look at the clock. In Europe, what does the AM start with? It starts with 0. In the United States, AM starts with 12 and then it goes to 1, as though 1 were more than 12. You know, we never question, why do we do these things? We just do them because they've always been done. They must be right. And a lot of times we get a lot of wrongnesses into our culture and it hangs around forever. Used to doing it that way. Technology is about change a lot. So I built this little adder subtractor in 8th grade and won a lot of science fair awards and got the first airplane flight of my life and everything. You could toggle the switches to put in ones and zeros. A switch was up, it was a 1, down, it was a 0. So you could put in a number by toggling all these switches to be 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. And then you'd look on a diagram I had and it says that's 79. And then you say, I want to add 123, and you would look and it's 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1. And there's 123, and the lights would light up, and you could look up the number on the lights, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, look on the diagram and see what the sum is. So it was a great project. I won I had learned so many steps, and it all started with that journal I found in my house by accident. I had learned how to count in binary, how it worked. I had learned little logic gates. I learned how logic gates could be added up into an adder unit that could add little ones and zeros. And adding ones and zeros is a lot simpler than adding our numbers. 1 plus 0 is 1. 0 plus 1 is 1. 0 plus 0 is 0. And the last rule, 1 plus 1 is 2. It's 0 and a carry. So it was a very simple system anyway. I built this, and I had learned that, and then I built this stuff into a circuit, and then I solved it. I knew electronics enough from my ham radio license to solve and discover some signals were leaking back in and messing up other bits of the adder subtractor. And I solved that myself, the engineering part of it, and they gave me the award for the best electronics project in the San Francisco Science Fair, and I was only in 8th grade, and this fair was all the way up to 12th grade. So I had a real early protege type start. In high school, my electronics teacher, I was into a lot of fun and pranks and sort of, a nerd on the outside, but I was strong in athletics. I got letters. I was in a lot of sports. I was just great in athletics, and I was president of clubs and things like that, but I just didn't know how to talk the way normal people talk, except to my electronics friends. And I took an electronics class, and the teacher said, well, Steve, you know everything. You're just playing pranks. So I've arranged for you to do something outside of the school. This is unusual when a teacher finds a solution for a kid that will help the kid that is outside the school. Teacher doesn't say, all the solutions are in this book and this classroom and what this teacher says. That's more normal. But this electronics teacher, every year, he found a few students ways to get them employed or get them to get some training at a business. I went down to Sylvania in Sunnyvale, and I got to program a computer once a week. A computer, this thing I would never see in my life. We didn't have them in high schools back then. So I went down to Sylvania, and I got a Fortran book, and I learned the computer programming language, Fortran. It was pretty simple, kind of like learning logic. It's not beyond a 5th grader, although what project you're going to do is tough to come up with. The first program I wrote was to solve a chess program called the Knight's Tour. where you bounce a knight around the chessboard. I was into chess back then. And you try to hit every square exactly one time and don't miss any squares and don't go back and hit any squares twice. So I said, a computer, I get to program a computer. It does 1 million things a second. And I thought, how fast could a human being count? I said, well, if a human being could even count 1 time a second, it would take them 2 weeks to get to 1 million. This computer does 1 million things in 1 second. Wow, that's like I'm Superman. It's so powerful. I wrote this program to bounce a knight around the chessboard randomly, and if it got stuck, back up and change a move. And if it got stuck, back up a few more steps and change moves. It's called a backtracking algorithm, and nothing came out of the computer, and I was bummed out. And then the next week, I went back and printed the chessboards and studied them. It was doing exactly what it should do, my program. It just was going to take 10 to the 25th years to get a solution. Quite a bit longer than the universe has been around. So, looking back, I didn't think about it directly then, but looking back on it, it implies raw speed of a computer doing 1 million things a second, 1 billion things, 1 trillion things, whatever, isn't going to solve some simple problems. To having a clever approach that comes from the human mind is the way to solve a lot of these kind of, difficult problems in life and even simple problems, especially things like puzzles. You have to have an approach. Well, while I was down at Sylvania, I spotted a booklet on a desk. I was way too shy to ever ask anybody, what is a computer? Where do I learn about computers? Are there books on computers? I don't think there were. The technical library in town, Kepler's, had a lot of scientific books, but I don't think they had anything on computers. Not sure. Never really looked into it. I didn't think I'd ever see a computer book. Here was a manual on a desk called the Small Computer Handbook. Wow, it sounds like something that teaches you what is a small computer. And the engineer saw that I was, looking at it, and he said, "You want it?" I said, "Yeah." So I took home this booklet, and it described the PDP-8 computer from Digital Equipment. It described the holding places called registers that could hold ones and zeros. And it described the memory, and it described 50 different little instructions that did things like add 1 to whatever's in the accumulator, or add 1 to whatever's in a memory location, or add a memory location to the accumulator, and check to see if it overflowed and the carry got set, if it was too big a number. And all these different instructions that could make decisions and do valuable calculating things. And I was amazed by that. This was the architecture of a computer. And if you think about a house has an architecture. Certain rooms of certain sizes, doorways, windows, where they are. That's the architecture. The other half of the formula is who builds the house? Somebody who knows materials, which type of lumber you can buy and how you can efficiently build, you go about and build the house out of the lumber once the architecture is defined. Well, now I had the description of a computer's architecture, and I had my knowledge of logic chips from my high school, from my elementary school projects, actually. So I said, I wonder if I could figure out and teach myself how to design the computer out of the chips. Closed my door, shut everyone out, had the music on real loud on my reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I sat down on paper and started drawing little pictures of the chips that might add up and be able to do the steps that this computer could do. And my first attempt, I'm sure if I went back and looked at my drawings, was a total disaster and wouldn't have worked and was nowhere near close. But eventually I had another free weekend. Closed my door in my room at home. Took out my paper and started designing, and I got a design down that pretty much I was sure would do every single operation this computer could do. It could add 2 numbers, it could subtract them, it could shift them left, which is like doubling them or halving them. It could test carries, and I felt real proud about that. And then every once in a while I got another weekend free, and I said, I wonder if I can, I made up a game with myself. What kind of game would you make up? I wonder if I can design this computer, and instead of using 95 chips, I wonder if I could use fewer chips, like 90. And I looked at my design, studied it, and I looked at chip manuals, and better chips came out, and I substituted some, redesigned it, and it took fewer parts. And it was a game. I felt proud. I felt like I was a winner. It was like a game that you can't find the rules of anywhere. Then a friend and I wanted to learn about other mini computers that were coming out in the late 1960s. So a friend and I, Alan Baum and I, would drive to Stanford Linear Accelerator Center because they probably had a technical library there among all the bright scientists that had computer magazines and articles and things, computer manuals. So we would drive up on a Sunday so they wouldn't notice us. And we figured out where the main building was. And there's very bright people that work at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, as you can imagine. Probably all PhDs. Well, very bright people tend not to lock things. So every single Sunday we went there, we found at least one unlocked door. Sometimes we'd have to climb a stairway and we'd find a door unlocked. And we always got in and we'd get in kind of a dim library, the lights weren't on, and they had computer magazines. And I'd read articles and I would look through them, and they would have little cards you could tear out. Fill in your name and address, send the card in, and they would send you a manual in the mail. So I started getting manuals for Hewlett-Packard mini computers, Varian mini computers, small IBM computers, digital equipment computers, Data General computers, and I would get these manuals. So on free weekends, what would I do? Shut my door, pull out some paper, and try to design this computer, that computer, and beat my record for how few of chips can I use. It got to a point, at one point, I got it down to where I went down to Fairchild. I kept trying to talk the companies into giving me chips so I could build a computer that I had designed, and they were offering me chips that were partially good. And they had no way to know, talking to a young kid on the phone, that was offensive to me. Because if I get a chip that half of it works, and then I get another chip that half works, I can do the whole job. But I was counting my design in terms of how small it was, and how efficient, and how simple. So I went down to Fairchild, and I showed them my design, and I said, here's my design using Fairchild chips. And here it is using Signetics chips, and it takes fewer chips. They looked it over. This brilliant engineer that had designed some of the best chips in the world that became the hallmark of my early Apple computer designs and the ones I loved the best for how they were thought out. That engineer said, wait a minute, these chips from Signetics are much larger chips with a lot more little wires hanging off of them. And the total complexity and size of the design with Signetics chips, even though it's fewer chips, it's a larger, more complicated design. There's more to it. And you know, I was stunned. He was right. The number of wires you hook things together with is how complicated something is. So my rule then became, how small does it fit onto a PC board? That was how I rated myself. One day, Data General introduced a computer called the Data General Nova. They sent out a brochure describing this little mini computer, but it was really introducing all the top executives of the company and where they had come from. But on the last page, they gave the instruction set of the computer, the ones and zeros. And instead of having 50 little instructions like all these other computers, it had one long instruction with a bunch of ones and zeros. And some of the ones and zeros meant part of the, which register to be in one side of the adder and which register to be in the other side, and whether to add, subtract, or, and, change zeros to ones, whatever. Had all those instructions. All these little bits had independent little meanings, and it was strange. I thought, boy, they did a really weird, strange, different thing than anyone else has ever done. And then I sat down one weekend, I closed my door, got out my paper, and I started designing this Data General computer. And by the time I was done in about one day, it was half as many chips as all of my previous computer designs. Half as many chips, just as good a computer. That shocked me. I learned a lot. You design the architecture of a machine based around the parts that are available. If you know both sides of the formula, you can do a much better job. And I told my dad, and this is the end of high school, I told him, someday I'm going to own a 4K Nova computer. And he said, well, Steve, it costs as much as a house. And I was stunned. I hadn't thought about that. And I said, well, I'm going to live in an apartment. I was going to have my 4K computer. Why 4K? 4K bytes of memory was the minimum you needed to run a programming language like Fortran. I wanted a machine that I could type programs in, just like my Knight's Tour program, like I had done in high school. And you had to have at least 4K of memory and a computer language to do that much. Well, I went off to my first year of college, University of Colorado. And what happened was I had 800s on all the math and science SATs, and normally you'd think, oh, pick one of these top technical schools, MIT or something. I flew off with some friends to visit the University of Colorado, my first time ever out of California. And we flew in, got in at night in our motel, and in the morning we woke up and turned on the TV and it said that it had snowed. Opened up the drapes, sure enough, there's snow. Went outside, The way that my friends tell it is like I was naked. I think I was probably in shorts. And they pushed me out in the snow. We threw snowballs. Had such a fun time walking around the snow for 2 days. That was the only college I would apply to. Had to go there. It was just so wonderful. I came to love the snow. I'd never been in snow in my life. So that was a big, it's basically this idea of follow your heart. Sense where you really want to do what's going to mean the most to you. And thank God my parents, were the same thinking. Didn't pressure me to kind of go some planned route in my scientific life. Well, in those 1968, computer classes were graduate classes. And I was a freshman. But because I was enrolled in engineering, I was allowed to take a beginning computer class. That was a very thorough class, covered operating systems and the architecture of computers, a lot of stuff that I already knew so well. I got an A+ in the course. But I thought, wow, I get to write programs. You just follow this procedure and you type your programs on punch cards, submit them at the computer center, and then they give you the printout. So I would run programs. I said, what kind of programs can I write? And I looked at the handbook of chemistry and physics, tables of numbers. And I said, I'll make a program that generates these Fibonacci numbers. And I'll make a program that calculates these factors of numbers. And I'll make a program that calculates powers of 2 and inverse powers of 2. I wrote 7 little thin programs, typed down most of them out, so the whole program took 1 card, using some clever techniques. And I'd run my programs into the university computer 3 times a day, put it in the morning, come back at noon and get my printout. 3 times a day, and I always printed 60 pages and punched out some cards that I could stick into the program and rerun it the next time for the next 60 pages, all numbered. And the next 60 pages, and I would run 60 pages times 7 programs times 3 times a day, and I was piling up reams of output in my dorm room, taller than I am. And one day they stopped my programs. And I went in to visit the professor, and he turned on a tape recorder. And he started out, this was very strange. And he goes, are you trying to get me? Do you have something against me? And I'm wondering, what's going on? I just ran some programs. I'm in a programming class. And he said, these aren't our programs. And I said, well, it's Fortran. It's a Fortran class. He said, this is our class programs. He got on the phone and called the computer department. I'd run them 5 times over budget. I didn't know they had budgets. Supercomputers cost a lot back then. I'd run our whole class 5 times over budget, and it was a popular class. So he made it sound like, he told them, you should charge Mr. Wozniak for this. Oh my God. This was the second most expensive out-of-state university in the country for an out-of-state student for tuition. And my parents had told me they could only afford to send me there 1 year. And I'd have to do another year at De Anza. And if I went to De Anza, they'd even give me a car. It was that much a difference in price. And I had chosen the University of Colorado. Well, they made it sound like it was going to be more than tuition to pay for this computer department thing. And I was so scared, didn't want to tell my parents. So the next year I went to a local college in Cupertino. A friend of mine duplicated the key to the computer room. They didn't know it. And we would go in at midnight, and we would turn on this IBM 360 Model 40, crank it up. He knew how to turn everything on because he worked there. He didn't know how to program. I knew how to program. So once all the printers and disk drives and tape drives were on, I would just start punching out my cards and running programs through, and midnight till 4 in the morning, and then we'd shut things up and hide the evidence we were using the computer. If a computer was sitting there unused, just wanted to take advantage of those few free hours. It wasn't like trying to be malicious or cost somebody money. It was really just, if something's not used, I want to use it, not to do anything bad. So do good things, develop your mind. But back at the University of Colorado, though, before that second year of college, electronics is fun. So I went down to Radio Shack and bought a high-speed transistor and soldered together a couple little capacitors and resistors, and I got a little tuning capacitor out of an AM radio that I could tune with my thumbnail and tune it up. And if I was near a little black and white TV, it would just jam the picture totally black. So then I went over they had a color TV in one of the dorms. It was a girls' dorm called Libby Hall. You'd go to this little basement area and everybody'd go over there to watch color TV. I sat in the back and this thing fit in my hand with a 9-volt battery, and I tuned it up, and it didn't jam the picture, it just fuzzed it up a bit. So this friend of mine who knew that I had it without any prearrangement slapped the TV, and I made it work. And then after a while, I jammed it again, and we got this little technique down that every time I jammed it, he'd hit it harder and harder or tune the fine tuning, and it would go good. And then for 2 weeks, they stationed one student next to this TV set every night. And whenever it went bad, it was his job to fix it. Well, if they went up to the fine-tuning control, I'd make it go good. And then they pull their hand away, it goes bad again. I was trying to frustrate them a little, but they started learning the magic of where your body is. One time a guy said, the repairman said it was the antenna. So they lifted the antenna up. What happens? TV goes good for a while. Then after a while they had to hold it up higher. And it worked fine, and then when it went bad, the guy climbed up on a chair. And it worked. So I was having fun doing this little psychology experiment. And one time, I got a guy to hold his hand on the middle of the screen for half an hour during Mission Impossible, and everyone stayed and watched the show with a hand on the middle of the TV. And his foot was up in the air on a chair, because if he put his foot down, the picture went bad. And he explained to everybody in the audience, he said, it's a grounding effect. So he must have been an engineer. I was so good at this, I never got caught once. I would put the little jammer in my left hand and go up to the TV and be the one trying to whack it. And I'd be playing the tricks with my other hand. And they didn't catch me. One time I sent out Morse code, and they thought it's the ham radio operator on the second floor. So they formed a little vigilante committee of like 3 or 4 of us to go accost him, and I was on the committee. So that was really fun. There's even more stories about it, but I'll go on. After my second year of college at De Anza, I thought, I really wanted to I wanted money for my third year of college at a 4-year school. So I took a year off and I worked as a programmer. I walked in a door, there was a computer they were designing, Tenet Corporation in Sunnyvale, and I worked as a programmer and to earn money for my third year of college. And while I was there, I told the executives that I used to design all these computers when I was in high school. The executive said, well, I have connections with the chip companies, and I can get you chips for a computer of your design. I said, whoa. I went home that night and designed up a quick one, all my own design, a real simple computer, and the executive got me the chips. I went down the street with my friend Bill Fernandez, and he would help put the chips together on a little board, switches and lights. You could toggle the switches to be ones and zeros, 1 0, 1 1 0 0. Push a button, and those ones and zeros would go into a memory. I had 256 bytes of RAM memory. And you could dial another number in and push the button, and it would go into the next byte in memory. You could start filling up memory with some ones and zeros that were a little program. And you could run it, and this was my machine. Well, Bill said, you got to meet this other guy that went to our high school, Homestead High School in Cupertino. He says, you got to meet Steve Jobs. He does electronics too, with chips and things, and he likes pranks. He does pranks like you do. So I know that I was the #1 prankster. I was not rated class clown because I was so good at never getting caught. I would do dozens of pranks in high school, and the principal would show other people he brought in, friends of mine, this stack of papers of things that had happened at the school that they were sure I had done, and I'd done some of them, most of them, and that they could he's too smart, they would say. We can't catch him, and I gloated. But they only caught me for one thing ever in high school. Only one time ever. They caught me partly because they lied, what'd they say? The cop said my buddy told him everything. So I confessed. But that was electronic. It was really an electronic project. It was an electronic metronome. You ever built one of those, any of you? Electronic metronome going tick, tick, tick. And I put it in a friend's locker. So later, eventually, I'm seated at a table in a lot of trouble. The principal, the vice principal, the dean, my counselor, 2 police officers. And the principal starts to tell me how he got brought by a teacher for this ticking sound. And he opened up the locker, and he clutched it to his chest and ran out to the football field and dismantled it. And I was laughing. I had to try to cough to cover up my laugh because I had a switch so that when you opened the locker, the ticking sped up. I figured, why just do a prank? You've got to do something special that makes it a little beyond what the normal person would do. And by this point of time in high school, back in high school again, I go back and forth in my stories. I was also pretty aware that I was a very good computer designer, because the computers I was designing, the digital equipment computers, my designs had half as many chips as theirs did. So I knew that, and I knew that I was developing tricks. I forced myself so intently to come up with the best tricks and use chips for things that they weren't supposed to be used for. And if you had a little piece of one chip left over, find a way to use that one instead of adding a whole new chip. And I was so good at all these techniques that could never be written in a book that I knew I had some skills that no other human in the world could probably match. And I like doing things, I was so shy. I don't like doing things where I'm doing the same thing as everyone else and being, competing and being compared. Well, I guess I did pole vaulting. But in this little electronics thing, it's like secret. It's your own private little thing. It's your own special thing. And you don't have to worry about competing with anyone, just trying to be your best and compete with yourself. So here I am. I built this computer and I meet Steve Jobs. He comes over and he says, he describes a couple of circuits he'd built with little counter chips and drivers for displays that could count digits and numbers and show the frequency counter. Like, what ton note are you playing on a guitar? And you play an E and it'll say, 550 or whatever, So he had built that sort of thing. I told him I had designed all these computers. And we talked about music that we liked, music that had substance, Bob Dylan type words and what they meant, and that the Beatles was just nice music, but it wasn't the important stuff, about what life was about. Steve was more of the counterculture guy, the barefooted hippie with the eating the seeds and hanging around people who had no money. He was younger than me. And I was always like, kind of like my father. I decided in life I wasn't going to be on any end of things. I wanted to be right in the middle. I'll have a house, I'll have a salary, I'll have a job, be a normal person. My feet will be on the ground. I'm not going to think weird outer space thoughts, I just want to do normal things. But I appreciated the counterculture. I appreciated their thinking. They were willing to think new ideas and other ways of thinking that might be more correct than what we have now. And Steve would go down, he described how at the high school, he went down and they would take these clay figures, move the clay frame by frame by frame, and take pictures frame by frame by frame, and create what's called a claymation movie. So, and here he is doing Pixar now. So a lot of these little goals that you start early in your life, wind up being the ways that you remember and you want to go and be good at someday. Steve read this book that he kept telling me about for years, about how there's a few people that are so special in the world, the Nobel Prize winners, the Shakespeares, the Isaac Newtons, that see things the rest of us don't, really lead the world, and that pretty much everyone else doesn't matter. And he always wanted to be around those special people. So when he went to college, I drove him up to Reed College in Portland, Oregon. And because there was a guy there at Reed College who had won a Nobel Prize in physics or something. And Steve wanted to be among the greatness. And we got there and he showed me the list of classes they handed him. He says, look, you have to take this literature class and you have to take this mathematics and you have to take all this stuff. I wanted to take nuclear physics and all the interesting things and study Shakespeare. And so that first week he didn't go to any of his classes. And I thought, oh boy, I would be in so much trouble. How could how could you let your parents' money down? He just wouldn't go to the normal classes. He stayed in a little tent in his dorm room with his girlfriend, and somehow he managed to stay at that college for like 2 years, never enrolled in a class, never paying tuition, but they let him stay because they liked him. He's a very persuasive person. He has a way of getting his intelligence to you. His intelligence gets through. And you don't want to you kind of want to stay near that sort of thinking in some sense. So he didn't pay any dorm fees or anything, but they let him stay. And he would just sort of attend whatever class he felt like once in a while. So, anything works. One time, my first experience before Steve worked at Atari, I was in a bowling alley in Sunnyvale, and there was a Pong game. A little TV screen with a ball going back and forth, and you could play paddles. And I was mesmerized. I never thought that somebody could actually put out all the signals of television, which I knew well, and make it into a game. Games were not software. Games were hardware. You took chips that could go ones and zeros, and you wired the chips together in the right way that caused ones and zeros to come out at the right time to show up as balls and paddles on a TV screen. And I looked at it and I told my fiance, I said, I wanted one of these. And I said, I'm going to build one of those. And always the big problem in computers is input-output costs money. When you have no money at all, no savings account, no cars, no rich family, you have nothing, what do? Well, Input-output device, the only free output device, I had thought about this way back in junior high school, is your TV set. Everyone has a TV. And if you're smart, you can put little pulses on a wire at the right times to show up as things on your TV set. And so I knew I could design that. And I built a Pong game. It had 28 little $1 chips on it. Very simple, low cost. I took it into Atari. They wanted to make it their first home Pong game. But this guy, Steve Mayer, said, no, oh, you should do it on one chip because you're going to sell millions. And he was right. They did it on one chip. They tried to hire me. And at that time, I worked for Hewlett-Packard. The greatest product of the era was the Hewlett-Packard scientific calculator, the first handheld calculator that engineers could calculate engineering formulas like cosines and sines and logarithms, exponential functions. What a powerful machine. You could just type digits instead of using the old slide rules. I was the slide rule whiz back in high school, but now it was out. Within a couple of years, you weren't going to be able to buy slide rules anymore. Scientific calculators from Hewlett-Packard took over the world. There was a recession, and every Hewlett-Packard division was losing money, but the company was still profitable just because of our calculator division. Somehow, even without a college degree, the engineers there heard that I was a great designer, brought me in for interviews, and hired me to design the calculators, to design the product that I loved most in the world. What an incredible job that I had for 4 years. While I was at Hewlett-Packard, I still loved electronics. So when I came home from work, instead of just watching TV and drinking beer all night, as soon as Star Trek was over, I'd get to work on projects. And one of my first projects, I started the first dial-a-joke in the San Francisco Bay Area. Many, many stories about that, too many to tell tonight. Many of them are in my book, but it was very difficult. Why was I mean, you'll meet a lot of people that'll tell you they started companies, but you're never again going to meet somebody who can claim they started the first dial-a-joke in a major area of the United States. You won't. This is 1972. Back then, you could not legally in the United States own or purchase or use your own telephone. You could not legally own or purchase or use your own answering machine. So I had to lease the one answering machine the phone company offered, the same one theaters used, the Codaphone 700, big huge tank. They probably still sell it to this day. And it cost as much as my apartment rental. So imagine a young engineer, your most expensive thing is your apartment, and then you pay it again just to have a machine so I could tell a joke a day. And people could dial into it. And I went through some Cupertino numbers, and everybody who had I had so many calls every day, thousands of calls every day, that anybody with a similar number got 100 wrong numbers a day, ringing them all day long. So I would switch the number to help them, and then other people would complain. And finally I said to the phone company, I said, well, I need a number that's easy for the kids to dial. And I got my first good number of my life, 255-6666. Beautiful number. One day I came home from work at Hewlett-Packard, and there were 2 people by my apartment door from the largest ski shop in Northern California, Any Mountain. And they were afraid to answer their own phone because it was 1-digit difference, and they got so many crank calls, they thought. So I finally went on to what's called the 575 bank of numbers. It's a set of numbers that radio stations have for contests, and it's wired up in a way that it doesn't busy out the lines between cities when they have contests, but you can dial it free from anywhere in the whole Bay Area. So I had 575-1625 for dial-a-joke. And the jokes I told were the popular jokes of the day, Polish jokes. And, you know, when did the Polak die drinking milk? Then the cow sat down. So I would tell these jokes, one a day, and then the Polish American Congress Incorporated threatened me with a lawsuit for defaming people of Polish descent. And my name is Wozniak, and they knew it. And I said to them, I talked to them on the phone finally, and I said, well, what if I change them to Italian jokes? And they said, that's fine. This was before political correctness. And, you know, so they didn't want you to make Polish people seem dumb. You know, people would say you don't want to make Italians seem sleazy, and you don't want to make, you know, there's stereotypes. And I agree, you know, with that to some extent. But now you can't mention a name of an ethnic group or be accused of it. I gave a commencement speech at the University of Colorado one year for engineering, and I threw out a joke. What do you call 4 Mexicans in quicksand? Cuatro cinco. not a bad joke about Mexican people, but boy, did it offend a lot of people. I got called to the mat on that one. So anyway, Atari said, we'd like to hire you because you designed this Pong game so nicely. I said, no way. I'm an engineer for life. I've always believed in engineers. I wanted to be an engineer. I'm working at Hewlett-Packard. Hewlett-Packard is an engineer's heaven, engineer's company. We're respected. We engineers at the bottom of the org chart are respected. I had decided to be an engineer for life and never go into management, never move up the ladder, because this company was so good to us. It was founded by engineers. It was infiltrated with engineers in all levels of management. The ideas for new products came from the bottom as much as they came from the top. We were just so effective in coming up with the ideas for products that would change our division's course and everything. And I felt very respected by that. Of course, we were building products that engineers use, so we engineers designing it were a good part of the market we were building for. We understood the market better than most companies. And I would never leave Hewlett-Packard. Well, Steve came to me one day, Steve Jobs came to me and he said, oh, by the way, the year that I had at Berkeley, I had my third year of college. I skipped talking about it. And there, Steve and I played with these little devices that we found out if you play little tones into an American telephone, it would wind up dialing calls anywhere in the world, via satellite or via undersea cables or any countries and everything for free. And it was just so mystifying, so amazing. I designed this great little beautiful digital one of the best digital designs of my life. It's the one time ever I got one little part of the circuit to do 3 things at once, not just 2, which is amazing enough. And Steve said, let's sell it. So we sold some of those, and that was a mistake. We shouldn't have, but we did. No, because I was the pure hacker who would explore the phone system to see what I could do, but all the calls to my friends and relatives I would still pay for. I would make sure I made them normally. I wouldn't use my box to save money, so I felt real proud of myself. But unfortunately, we sold them to other people, so they wound up making, stealing phone calls. Well, Steve, now he came to me and he said, look, this guy that runs Atari, Nolan Bushnell, wants a game made, a one-player Pong. And in the one-player Pong, you'd hit a ball against some bricks. Most of you know the game Breakout. So he said, can you design it? And I said, oh God, it'd be the thrill of my life to design a game that people really play. Oh, a video game, an Atari game. I'd never get a chance like this. This is amazing. And then Steve says, there's one hitch. Have to do it in 4 days. A game design out of hardware, not software, they weren't programs back then, would take 6 months. And I was a top designer, and I designed a Pong, which was similar, and I said, I don't think I can do it in 4 days, but I'll try. I guess Steve needed some money by then. He was buying into some orchard up in Oregon. I don't know what kind of orchard it was, but never knew. I hope it was an apple orchard. So he and some friends would go up there and do it. And so anyway, went into Atari, 4 days and nights, designed the thing on paper. We went into Atari. Steve would wire wrap it. Then we'd test it and find a couple bugs. I'd change the circuit. We'd do it some more. And 4 days and nights, no sleep. Both of us came down with mononucleosis, the sleeping disease. And I was very lightheaded during that non-sleep period. We designed a working game and gave it to Atari too. That's an amazing success story. And I was, it was over a weekend, but I still had some of the days I had to work at Hewlett-Packard, and I was taking classes at San Jose State in engineering. So it was a rough time, but we got it done. And there's some question as to how much we were paid on that, but I don't want to get into that. Because I would have done it for free. It's so amazing to get a chance to do something so important to the world, in a sense. Another project that came along after that, Steve Jobs and I went over to a friend's house, a guy known as Captain Crunch. From the days of making the free phone calls, he discovered that the little whistle they gave in Captain Crunch cereal played exactly the tone that seized the phone line and put it at your command, listening for your instructions where to dial for free anywhere in the world. So he called himself Captain Crunch and went down. He's typing on one of those big metal teletype machines that are so expensive you could never afford one, kind of. And he's typing away and he says, Steve, I'm playing chess with a computer in Boston at MIT. And then he has the printout print out a list of all these different colleges, Berkeley, Stanford, where they had computers. He could log on to different computers and then run things that were set up for guests. It was the ARPANET. the early forerunner of today's internet. And he's able to switch between computers, and it felt so powerful. It felt like ham radio, where you're a Superman that can reach out to other states, like a blue box that you can call for free anywhere in the world. And here was this guy typing to computers as far away as Boston. I had to have that, just like the Pong game. And I went home, and over a little period of time, designed a little circuit of my own. Hardware, running wires from chips to chips that would put little pulses on the wire into the TV set that showed up as letters of the alphabet on my TV. And then I built a modem, and I could call a number at Stanford. Modems were very slow speed then. 300 baud was the fastest they had. 300 characters a second. The one I built, I can't remember if it was, I think it was 300 baud, and that means, you know, a line of text takes 2 seconds on the screen just to print the characters. Very slow, but I designed my computer to be optimized around even that. And I could type on it. Now I had to have a keyboard. My output device was free. It was my home color TV. I unscrewed the back of the TV set, just like for Pong, took an oscilloscope and saw some signals inside the TV, looked at the schematic that they shipped the TVs with back then to find out where the likely place for video was, built a little circuit that got my video showing up on the TV set. That was free. Now I had to get a keyboard. I started going into work at Hewlett-Packard every morning around 6, ahead of all the other engineers. And I would grab the latest computer magazines and go through every article and every ad searching for parts. And I found a company offering a keyboard you could type on. It was uppercase only, but they were offering it for $60. That's like maybe $600 today. So it was very expensive, but it was the most expensive thing I had to buy in this whole project. I bought one. And now I had a keyboard, and I could type, and my words would go to the computer in Boston. And the Boston computer would type back to my TV set. And it was a little terminal I'd built myself. Oh my God, this was great to show off. Steve Jobs came by and said, there's this time-sharing company in Mountain View called Call Computer. They have expensive terminals that they lease to businesses to write software in BASIC for their clients and to do their business on. So why don't we sell them this little cheap terminal? And we actually did. So we sold them something like, I don't know, 25 of these terminals of my design. And that was the second thing we sold. Next, my friend Alan Baum called up and said, there's some people that are starting a club for people who have video terminals and things. Oh, wow. I was so shy back then. I would never talk to anybody hardly out of my little sphere. And I thought, wow, I'll be a hero. I'll be a star. I'll go there and show them. I've got a video terminal design. You can build it yourself. It's so few parts. It's so cheap. You can have your own terminal. And I went to this club. I never would have gone if my friend had said it's for people who are interested in microprocessors, because I had missed out on the whole microprocessor revolution. I hadn't heard about them. I didn't know what they were. We met the first night in a small garage, maybe about 20 of us, 30 of us, and it was kind of dark and raining lightly outside in the dark, and it was in Menlo Park, Gordon French's garage. And all these people somehow were aware that there had been a Popular Electronics cover with a computer, just like the old mini computers, a big rectangular front panel that looked intimidating with switches that you could dial ones and zeros and push a button and the ones and zeros would go into memory. And it came with 256 bytes of memory. And you could buy this thing at a human affordable price. Like my ham radio, you had to build it and bolt everything together and solder all the wires in place, but you could build a little thing called a terminal, a computer, but it really wasn't. It was just a glorified microprocessor, but if you added enough parts to it, you could actually run a computer language. And it was called the Altair. And everybody in the room that night was talking about this thing, microprocessors and the computers that are coming. And I was so embarrassed because all I had was my video terminal. Well, that night I took a data sheet home for a microprocessor. I studied the data sheet, the electronics of it, the timing signals. I said, oh my God, these microprocessors are basically just like those mini computers I used to design in high school. They're like that little cream soda computer I built 5 years before when I met Steve Jobs. I said, oh my God, I'm in business. I get a microprocessor, I can finally have the computer that I was going to have all my life. So I couldn't afford an Intel microprocessor for $400. I had to choose one. And I found out that as a Hewlett-Packard employee, we had a deal for $40, you could get a Motorola one. So I came to Hewlett-Packard late at night and did some thinking about chips and looked them up. I already had a video terminal. I already had a machine that I could type to a computer in Boston, and it could type back to my TV. I said, I'll cut out the middleman, which is Boston. Well, actually, Boston's the far man. I said, I'll cut out the far man, and I'll just put a little middleman in the way. My own microprocessor and RAM. But you know, every computer that's ever been built has switches and lights for ones and zeros and buttons to push them into memory. But I had done that 5 years before I'd built that. And what popped in my head was, look at our Hewlett-Packard calculator. We really have a little processor inside of it. It's on 2 chips. We couldn't put it all on 1 chip, but we have a little processor. When you turn on the calculator, the processor runs a program that says, is a key being pressed? If you push the 5 button, the program says, aha, a key got pressed, figures out it's the 5 button, puts a 5 in the display, and comes back saying, is a key being pressed? And one by one, as you press the keys, the calculator does what it's supposed to do. I said, why don't I write a little program that looks to see if you're typing on this human keyboard? And whatever you type, it reads into memory, and when you hit return, it goes and does what you told it to do, which might just be put some ones and zeros into memory. So I wrote a clever little 256-byte program to do that. I called it the monitor. And 256 bytes took me 2 chips in those days, 2 little PROM chips. They only did, it was that, we had those few transistors on chips back then. So 2 chips had this little program in. I went in, designed my computer for a Motorola microprocessor, and a company introduced the 6502. And it was going to be the best, latest, newest microprocessor. It had lots of what's called addressing modes, and in my computer architecture time, addressing modes meant more to me, like the IBM 360s, than all the arithmetic calculations in the world. So I knew this was the best processor, and they were going to sell it for $20, a $20 bill, and they were going to introduce it at a show in San Francisco, local. You know, you couldn't buy a microprocessor back then to save your life. If you went down to a distributor, they'd ask you to fill out all these forms as though you're a company. Who's the CFO? Who's the purchasing officer? You know, where are your accounts? What's your bank account? I'm just a person. I just want to buy some things from you. Those distributors made it so impersonal. It was difficult to buy a chip, a microprocessor. There weren't stores that sold them. So they were going to sell this thing over the counter at the WestCon show in San Francisco. I went up, as did many of my friends, many of the attendees of our homebrew computer club. Went to San Francisco and bought their 6502s and came back home with that chip and studied it. And I changed my design to be for a 6502. And actually, if you go back and look at an Apple I board, you'll see that it's labeled to take either a 6502 or a 6800. You just have to plug in a few more parts for a 6800. Now I had my processor, and I had this. And I thought, all these little computers that people are trying to save their money for, we were all the weaklings. We weren't company executives. We weren't people that had any money at all. Almost everyone was like myself. Maybe a few $100 saved up, maybe not. I didn't have that. And so that meant it would take us a year to save $400 to buy this little kit called an Altair that you could twiddle some ones and zeros and put them into memory and make some lights flicker, but you couldn't really do a computer program. Because to do a computer program, you'd have to put 4K of memory in it. And then you'd have to buy Bill Gates Basic. Bill Gates, his name was known in our club, a guy that had written a BASIC, and it was on paper tape, until Dan Sokol took the paper tape and returned about 50 copies of it, and then we got the first letter against software piracy from Bill Gates. Not that anyone had a computer that could run it. That's the problem. Paper tape would go into expensive teletype. Nobody really had a computer that could run computer programs or anything, and I thought, I want a real computer. I want to take a step beyond. And basically, I have this little terminal that I can already type to. I'll put a microprocessor and memory on it. Memory. In 1975, the first 4K dynamic RAMs were introduced. The dynamic RAMs were the first ones ever that were going to be cheaper than magnetic core memory. Magnetic core memory is all these little planes of tons of little tiny wires going through little magnetic donuts, and you see them in museums. But finally, they were going to get replaced by normal electronic memory that just takes electronic symbols the way it's kind of pure. And I thought, wow, the dynamic memories, every one of the computer kits, the Altairs, the M-Size, a ton of companies, about 15 companies had sprung up with these little computer kits. They all used static memories. because you don't have to be an engineer to design static memories. You run a wire from a microprocessor pin called address. You run the wires from the address pins over to the pins on the chip called address, and it works. It's that simple. With dynamic memories, dynamic memory forgets every one of its bits every 2,000th of a second. So within a 2,000th of a second, you have to have a way to read every bit that's in it and replace it with itself to keep it alive. It's a little extra design time. I sat there and thought, well, gosh, instead of the dynamic memories are 4 times cheaper, 4 times fewer chips. I can have 4K bytes of memory, my goal, in 8 chips. Whereas if I used the old static RAMs, the 1K static RAMs, I would have 32 chips. I hate numbers of chips. I always design things to be the fewest chips possible. So I'll build it with the dynamic memories. And sure, it takes me 5 extra chips to do this little refresh and keep them alive, but that's the way I went. Good choice. So I was the only one. None of these other little starting hobby kits were coming out with dynamic memory. Now, I wanted to help the world get to a good place. In our club, Lee Felsenstein would guide the meetings. He had a lot of, experience back to running anti-war marches and all, and he couldn't communicate well enough with everyone over the phone. And he wanted computers that you could type messages into bulletin boards, and 100 people, 1,000 people could read it and know how the route got changed. And other people spoke about how we only use 1/10 of our mind. And once these computers are actually teaching children interactively, they're going to be using all their entire mind, and they're going to be so much brighter than we ever were. And businesses were going to use them galore, and people were going to run the lights in their houses and their garage door openers off their computers, and all these great ideas. And I thought, I want to help society with my talents as a designer. I want to help the world get to this beautiful place we're going. So I went down to the club and I passed out my designs, and I passed out my code listings, all for free, no copyright notices. And I passed them out and I said, look, you can build your own. Look how small it is. Look how simple it is. It's just a bunch of $1 chips on one board, except for the microprocessor. Anyone here can do it. But the trouble is, it's a daunting task to solder hundreds of wires. So Steve Jobs came to me, and by this point in time, he was coming to some of the club meetings, and he said, there's a lot of people interested in your design. Why don't we make a PC board? He didn't say, let's start a computer company. Steve had done a lot of work selling surplus parts for companies like Haltech in Mountain View, and he said, let's sell the PC board so it'd be easier for them to make their computers. They'll get the chips, plug them in, solder it real quickly, and they'll have a computer. And at first I said, well, I wasn't sure we'd sell enough to get our money back. We'd have to invest maybe $1,000. And Steve wanted to build the boards for $20 each and sell them for $40 each. And we'd have to sell 50 of them, and I didn't know if we'd sell 50 boards, at the computer club. And Steve said, well, maybe we'll lose our money, but for once, the 2 of us will have our own company. Who could turn that down? We've been best friends for 7 years, so of course we started our company. It was a later time, I picked Steve Jobs up at the airport flying back from Oregon, and he came up with the name, I got a great name, he said, Apple Computer. We're driving in my car. And whoa, that's a good name. I said, what about Apple Records, the big record company of the day? And he says, well, they're a record company, we're a computer company. I was just in Athens and I saw a big billboard as we drove in, and it said, Apple Underwear. And I said, well, they're an underwear company, we're a computer company. So he came up with the name Apple, and we both tried to think up techie names, but we couldn't beat that one, so we named ourselves Apple Computer to sell PC boards for $40. I said, before we start the company, everything I design is owned by my employer, Hewlett-Packard. So I've got to check with them. I can't risk my job. And I went to Hewlett-Packard and lined up my boss and the lab manager, his boss, and some other people around a big table in the conference room. And I described how you could build a little computer that ran the language BASIC. And you could build it for $800 and would work on your home TV set. And boy, and he had all these reasons. It couldn't be a Hewlett-Packard product, because if there's a problem, is it the computer or is it the TV? It's hard to fix. Hewlett-Packard likes to build complete products that are guaranteed to work. Reliability was the name of the game, and this new type of computer wasn't going to fit Hewlett-Packard's culture. And he didn't have the resources, the people to work on it, so he turned me down. And Steve Jobs and I went ahead and got our pay. I sold my Hewlett-Packard calculator, my most valuable possession. My HP 65 calculator, I sold it for $500. and I only got paid $250. Steve got a few $100, and we paid a friend to design a PC board for us. Got it into work at Apple. You know, I mean, Hewlett-Packard, I was showing off this little board. It was so beautiful. I look at it now, it's pretty ugly and awful, but it was the Apple I computer. And I was sitting at Hewlett-Packard and the phone rang. Steve Jobs says, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yeah, I'm on a lab stool." And he says, "I just got a $50,000 order." This is the most shocking financial news in all of Apple's history to me. This was a shock because for $50,000, we have no money. We have a few $100 each we've scrambled together. And my salary at Hewlett-Packard is only $24,000. This is twice my annual salary. It was scary. There was one computer store in the South Bay area in Mountain View, and the Byte Shop, and they had seen me demonstrating my computer at the club. By this point in time, as soon as I got my computer, I said, and was showing it off at the club, I realized, I needed a computer language, and I sniffed the air. There was no computer language for my chosen microprocessor, the 6502, and I said, I will write the first BASIC, and people will hear about me like Bill Gates. Because I was too shy to talk to people unless I did something great in design, they would come talk to me. That was how to get my socialization energies out. And I wrote this BASIC as fast as I could, and the very last, I took out the floating points, the decimal points, because I only wanted my computer language for two things: playing games and doing my computer simulations at Hewlett-Packard, the work that I used to use their computer that was shared with 40 engineers. Now I wouldn't have to use the Hewlett-Packard computer anymore. I didn't need decimal points in my numbers, and being a real strong mathematician, didn't believe in them that much. But I regret taking this out. It cost Apple a lot, including Microsoft getting the GUI eventually. Well, so I had this BASIC and all, and I had never written a BASIC language. I had never taken a course in it. But you know what? When you have a strong goal and you have to achieve, I need a computer that can run a language. When it's that strong, you will find the ways to do it. You'll write any code and think about, come up with ideas and make it work. And I actually tell people I had an MIT education because my friend from high school, Alan Baum, had gone off to MIT. And sometimes in the mail, he would send me back big stacks of Xeroxes of his books there. So I had a little bit of reading on computer languages and the things, but I wrote my BASIC. Hewlett-Packard turned me down. Now we had a $50,000 order, and I got a little worried about this Hewlett-Packard thing, so I called Hewlett-Packard's legal department, and we circulated a description that I wrote of the machine to every single department of Hewlett-Packard, and they all turned it down. So now I had a written legal release to do what I wanted, and I still worked at Hewlett-Packard. This computer, the Apple I, started getting Stephen Jobs, and I noticed we would get press would call us, do little interviews. They were interested in all these little burgeoning hobby computers, ones that you sort of had to build yourself. The Apple I, you still had to do some building yourself, hooking up wires to a keyboard, hooking up wires, transformers to the wall, hooking up something to a monitor or a television set somehow. So it wasn't quite pull it out of the box and use it type, what I call a personal computer yet. But it had enough memory for a computer language, and I had my computer language. You used a cassette tape to read your programs in. You push the play button, these signals on, sounds like modems, and eventually it reads into the computer, and the computer beeps, got the program. So this Apple I, we started getting, noted in a few magazines, hobby magazines, and, nothing that was really building up much money for us. Steve ran the business. Steve would get the girl across the street to do the accounting. He would call the magazines to get publicity. He would get data sheets made. He would use his phone, and it was in his bedroom at his house, and he would call stores around the country that were opening up, saying, do you want this Apple I computer? Here's the price. And we priced it at retail, we priced it at $666.66. Because I was into repeating digits. I had a lot of phone numbers by then that had repeating digits. To this day, my phone numbers are all 888 type numbers. So it made sense. We didn't know 666 was a special number until people told us. And we sold it to the stores for $500, actually. So we had this little business going, and Steve would also order parts that way. Now, how do you build 100 computers for $500 each? How do you build 100 computers when you have no money? Well, the way we did it was we got the parts on 30 days credit. Our PC boards were manufactured at a place down in Santa Clara. And the same place that manufactured the PC boards, as soon as they came off the line, they had a ton of workers, girls mostly, that were sitting there plugging parts in, and they'd plug all the parts in and put it over a wave soldering machine. We could put all the parts into our computer and get it soldered for $13 is all. My God, if you can assemble a computer for $13, why would you ever sell it as a kit, where somebody's going to have to spend 40 to 80 hours just to build it? $13 is all, so it was beautiful. Ours fit all on one board, and we'd drive down to that place in Santa Clara. So when the chips came out of a closet, a 30-day clock started ticking. We had to pay for the chips within 30 days. It would take a little while for them to assemble enough of the boards down there. We would drive down, pick up some of the boards, and then we would drive them back to Steve's house, and there's where we had the garage. The garage wasn't a company. We didn't design anything there. We didn't have a telephone, but we had one lab bench. And we would put the board on the lab bench and plug it together with a keyboard and everything. And if it worked, we'd put the board in a box, a white box. And if it didn't work, I would figure out what was shorted, and a pin on a chip got bent under, and fix that. And we'd fix it and put the good computers in the boxes. Once we had about 25 boxes full of computers, we'd drive them down to the store in Mountain View and get paid cash. So we cycled everything in 10 days, and we had 30 days credit. We did it because we didn't have a lawyer involved. Nowhere. And it worked. And it worked, so we supported ourselves with absolutely no money. Now, that computer, the Apple I, was not a Wozniak-designed computer, per se. It was a very slow terminal designed to talk over slow modems, with a little microprocessor thrown in to be a quick little hack together that did the job of a computer. But it did it sort of slowly. The Apple II, I designed it as a pure computer. Back when I was at Atari, so sleepless for 4 nights in a row, my head is spinning. Out on the factory floor, they had a game, and the games back then were based on black and white TVs because color televisions cost way too much to put in arcade games yet. And to design circuitry that could put out color, nobody knew how to do it, and there just wasn't, it would have been too hard. So the games were all on black and white TVs, and the little black and white dot would go across the screen. But Atari had one game where they put green Mylar and yellow Mylar and red Mylar and blue Mylar on the screen. As the ball went across, it was like a rainbow. It was changing colors. And I just sat there and stared at it thinking how beautiful color is. And then I know exactly where I was in Atari, at which lab bench, and Steve was breadboarding over at that bench. And this idea sprung in my head of how I could use a $1 chip to generate signals that looked a lot like color television signals if you did things right. What a weird idea, because normally color television might cost, hundreds of dollars or $1,000 to build on 2 big boards, each as big as the Apple II. And I had this clever idea of how to do it with one little cheap chip. So I filed that idea away. Well, I pulled it out for the Apple II, and I designed the Apple II as a color generating circuit at the very bottommost level. And I came up with the most incredible ideas I'd ever come up. I was a top designer, but the most incredible idea is to shrink an 8-chip circuit down to 5, and then take a different approach called a state machine and get it down to 2.5 chips, and then search the manuals and find a little shift register that could put out the timing signals to the RAMs and do it in 1 chip or 1.25 chip. Everything in the world condensed in this Apple II design. I decided rather than have a memory for my TV screen and a memory for the computer, make it 1 memory. And that condenses the number of chips and makes that, and I did everything. It wound up faster. It wound up 10 times the computer of the Apple I in half the chips. It was so incredible a design. When the color worked, Steve Jobs and I sort of knew we had something big. We didn't pass this one out for free. We didn't go down to the club and say, here, anybody can have it. We knew that we had a computer that we could probably sell 1,000 a month of. One problem, how do you build 1,000 when they cost $250 each to build? You need $250,000. That's probably like millions of dollars today. So where would we get it? We went down to Commodore. We told Commodore, they were sort of interested in this technology, and we told them they could have our machine for, Steve Jobs made up these numbers. I could never talk big money numbers. I was just an engineer, proud of my design. He said, well, we'll give it to you for a few $100,000, and then you give us some jobs and to work, so we can work for you and all this. And I was kind of embarrassed. And Commodore said, no, people don't want all these fancy features you have, color and graphics and high resolution and sound and paddles. They just want, the basics for the cheapest price. And I'm sure that Commodore's machine they finally came out with, the PET, cost more to build. It had a little black and white TV built in. It had crickety keyboards. It was just, I'm sure it couldn't have cost as little as ours. And we went to Atari, and their hands were filled making the first home Pong game. Big, big project for them. So they couldn't divert to computers. We went to venture capital, and they didn't like the fact Steve and I had never gone to business school. We were in our young 20s. No business experience in business, no business school. We couldn't talk the business language. They'd say, what's the market? I'd say 1 million. How do you know that? I'd say, well, there's 1 million ham radio operators, and computers are more popular than ham radio. It's an awfully good answer, but it's not quite business talk. And we found an angel, Mike Markkula. And he saw what we had, he believed in it, and despite the fact that all the big computer companies were saying it was a little hobby market that was going to be nothing, insignificant, going to go away, wasn't going to be a threat to what real computers did, they were all saying that. And the analysts were just about to start predicting that this was going to be a large market, approaching billions of dollars. And Mike Markkula said, look, he was willing to put up the $250,000. And he did, eventually. And he became an equal third partner to Steve Jobs and I. So there were 3 of us that were all equal, but you never hear about Mike Markkula because he didn't come from nowhere. He had the money. He had made it on a stock option. And we started writing a business plan, thinking about who we were and what we were trying to do for the world. We had wanted to be real positive social thinking with this new machine, the Apple II. Steve Jobs' role would be to basically do everything needed to learn to run all the aspects of a company as we grew. The operations, to deal with the operations, deal with the marketing, deal with engineering, get parts supplies and sales and everything. Mike Markkula would be in charge of marketing because that's what he had done at Intel. I would be in charge of engineering because I had designed the whole thing, all the hardware, all the software. And so Mike agreed to put up $250,000. And he said I had to leave Hewlett-Packard. And I said, what? Why? I worked at Hewlett-Packard and just moonlighting. In 1 year, I designed 2 computers. I designed cassette tape interfaces. I wrote a BASIC. I got games going with paddles and everything. I wrote all this other kinds of software and developed, printer interfaces and things. And I did all this, just, on the side. So he said, no, you got to leave Hewlett-Packard. And he said, you got to decide by Tuesday. So I thought, and I went inside myself. And one of the things was I was one of those real independent people that was never going to be swayed by money in my life. And I went back to Mike Markkula and Steve Jobs on Tuesday, and I told them no. That I wanted to work at Hewlett-Packard as an engineer for the rest of my life, because it was a good company for engineers, and I wanted to design computers. I wanted to make hardware. I wanted to make software. But you know what? I was doing that on my own, on the side, at night, so I could keep doing it. Well, Steve Jobs got all my friends and relatives to start phoning me. Saying, take the money. It was a lot of money. Take the money. And finally, my friend Alan Baum called up. He worked at Hewlett-Packard, and he said, look, Steve, you can be an engineer and become a manager and get rich. Or you can be an engineer and stay an engineer and get rich. And it was really, I needed one other person, one other friend in my world to say you can be an engineer and start a company. You don't have to run it. You can just stay an engineer. So I left Hewlett-Packard that day. And I wasn't going to step on other people's toes. I'm too mild a guy. I don't like to push other people around. I don't like to tell people that what you've done is wrong, it's bad, you've got to go my way. I don't like to do that. I like to do great engineering work, and I don't need to tell people in marketing, you got, your ideas, you should be considering this other thing. And so I decided, I would do my engineering, do it excellent, and that was my ticket into Apple, and we started the company. Right away, Mike Markkula was the one who had business experience. He knew how to organize a company, what kind of people we needed. We needed a president. We found a director of a division of National Semiconductor, Mike Scott, young guy who had run this division so well, and he came on board as our president. I am so thankful we had him. He was our president from the day we started the real corporation until we went public. And he knew how to get rough and get the things done that needed doing and push people the right way, but how to be soft and make people like him and appreciate him. And when one of his first jobs was putting out the manual. The president of the company would do the manual. And it was all based upon my code mainly and my designs. Almost everything came from me. But he wanted to put out the sources. I wanted to put out all my sources too, because I wanted the world to learn about computers the way I had learned, which was from other people's manuals. I wanted our manual to have the diagrams that people could go down and see every signal worked if they wanted. They could study code listings in different languages and learn how to write their own and make little cards that plugged into our machine. We sprung, one of the most amazing things about the Apple II is we sprung this whole industry of young people that had nothing, just working as technicians, working as teachers, working as students. They were just students in their house developing something clever, software or hardware, for the Apple II and starting companies. I mean, I'd go over to their houses and meet these kind of people. Thousands of little companies sprung up that never could have ever, out just the little people. It was one of the most amazing things, and you could learn so well from this computer, the Apple II. Always worked, not one bug was ever found in all these years in the hardware, the software, so real proud of that. Now, I was going to get into, I think we've run long enough today, I was going to get into some of the changes in Apple throughout time and other projects that we got into, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you think up the questions for that. We're going to take a question answer period now, and your questions can cover evolution of Apple throughout time. You might think about that. There was an Apple III, there were Lisas, there were Macintoshes, different versions of Macintoshes, different levels of it. There were people in Apple that are kind of interesting personalities, and there are iPods and there are iPhones, and there's lots. Apple TV.
Please, whenever people ask the question, please repeat the question.
I know how to do the questioning. So, yes, it's open. Somebody must have any little question at all. Yes? If it's too personal, don't go there. I go anywhere. I don't care. I don't have anything out of range.
I know engineers back then, brilliant people, but they make a lot of sellers. How did your father feel about so much money so young in life?
Okay, how did my father feel about me coming into so much money so young in life? I saw money, actually, I was one of those people that saw it as kind of an evil, a threat, that it will take you down, it corrupts a lot. And I wanted to fight that in my life. All of a sudden, Steve Jobs and I had more money than our parents had ever made in their lifetime. And it was still growing hugely. Didn't think about it that much at first, because you can't really change your lifestyle or anything else really drastically and really rapidly. So it was just kind of a shock. But I mean, yeah, it was a welcome one. I don't think it's that what we did is a zero-sum game where what we did cost somebody else that money that we made. I think it brought something new to the world, created wealth, and we got part of it. In my own life, I was just determined I did not want so much money, so much more than you could ever want in your life. And I took all the steps in philanthropy to give it to museums, everything, and I have just a modest amount left. I do not want to be. My friends are not CEOs. They're the guys who are homeless sometimes. They're interesting people. That's who I like to live with. How did my father feel about it? Well, obviously he was very proud. He told us at the start all the reasons that we weren't making money, because if we valued our own time and gave it a dollar value, we were losing at the early days. But no, he was extremely proud as it went on. My dad was, and he was so important. He was such a good teacher, such a good father, and taught me a lot of just even philosophies about the world, my own values, even my political values, so much like him. But he didn't say this is how it should be for a reason. Here's how some people think, here's how other people think, here's kind of where I fall, and I felt very much like my dad. I wish he were still around. I miss him greatly. I don't think Apple would have happened. Well, it wouldn't happen. He gave me the engineering training. Whenever I had a question, he'd pull out a blackboard and explain how the electrons flowed through wires, through transistors, what the equations were. So I was lucky. Over there?
Can you give us an idea of how PCs went one way and Apple went the other way, and how they're starting to...
Sure. It was around 1980. Apple was very successful, gone public. We realized that our market had really exploded when VisiCalc came out, the first spreadsheet program. All of a sudden, businessmen went into a store and saw that they could, month by month, map their income and outgo and change some numbers and do some forecasting that would take them 10 years by hand. They could do in one day. So they started buying these computers en masse, Apple II and VisiCalc. Apple II and some standard peripherals, and VisiCalc. So we said, let's be smart and build the Apple III. And the Apple III will be the Apple II with those extra boards they plugged in, memory and and works with more characters on a monitor screen. And then we'll be building exactly what they want. And we had some people with the Apple III that some parts of them were very good. These were like purists that had to do Dvorak, but they designed, if you wanted to move a file from somewhere on a floppy disk to somewhere else, we had floppies by now, that was one of my great designs, but if you wanted to move a file, you had to run a program and answer menu questions and choose which file you wanted to move and what you wanted to call it, and then here came a PC. The first little PCs, and they had this operating system that Microsoft had written. Or Microsoft hadn't written, I'm sorry, they had marketed to IBM. And there you could type in commands to move files directly. You didn't have to go into a program. And I thought their approach was actually a lot better, but our Apple II was so great. It was going to take them 3 years to pass up the Apple II in worldwide sales. Because by 1980, the Apple II had sold like 1 million computers. I mean, it was just hugely successful everywhere in the world. IBM had a huge advantage. A lot of companies bought IBM mainframes. And in buying IBM mainframes, any product from IBM was already okayed. So it was easy for little managers inside the company to approve IBM products. If it was Apple, they had to go through a lot more paperwork and steps to get it approved. So IBM had really the sales route into businesses. And that's where we sort of lost the market by 1983. They kind of exceeded us there. When it came to the Macintosh, which might be more where your question was aimed at, we had a Macintosh. It had little pictures. The businessmen were used to using their PCs with a program called 123. You know, very good program that tied together 3 other programs. And here was the Macintosh with pictures. So every businessman I ran into said, well, Macintosh is a toy because it has pictures. And of course, we were following this lead that Jeff Raskin had brought into Apple, which was you can build the same exact technology that can do the same job at the same speed, but you can make it real easy for the user. If you think and put in a lot of your own software, you can make it work nice and easy the way the user wants to work. Who's more important, the human or the technology? If the human's more important, the company should put a lot of effort in to doing things the human way. If the technology is more important, you put the technology and you ask the human being to learn how to use it and modify their ways. Well, I think we've gone way, way back since the early Lisa Macintosh dreams, way, way back on the scale of human and technology. Well, so it's true. The Macintosh was a nice machine for college students, nice machine to play games and type on a word processor, but it didn't do the business stuff. So we had to really work. Microsoft did Excel for the Macintosh first, before PCs. We had to do a lot of dealing with them to get that. I forget, I think we gave them, maybe that was where we gave them the GUI rights. And what more can I say? I mean, it was obvious we had the better machine, and now today, every computer's a Macintosh. Wouldn't you agree? So on the PC, you had to type text, and the Macintosh had pictures, and everything does. One of the things about calling it a toy was similar to something that happened to me at Hewlett-Packard. The Texas Instrument calculator came out, and the Hewlett-Packard calculator used reverse Polish notation, a big computer science concept. It really used it because we could get so few transistors on a chip, we couldn't write a big enough program to handle parentheses. So Texas Instruments calculator came out with parentheses, and we laughed at it. It's a toy. It's for the simple people. And we pulled out a card with a big, huge equation on it that almost always took me a few tries to get right on my Hewlett-Packard calculator. And we laughed. You could never do that equation on a Texas Instruments calculator. How could you ever do it with parentheses? And I said, I'll be the guinea pig, because I thought of myself as being really smart. I took the equation, and I started looking at it, thinking, how many parentheses do I type before the first operation you do in the equation? And then I said, there's no way I'm going to remember it all. There's no way a human being can do it. So I wiped my mind clear, like Plato would say, wipe your mind clear. And then what popped in was, what if I just type it in left to right? I typed in all the parentheses that were there, guessed if the square root comes first or second, as fast as I could type it on the Texas Instruments calculator, and I got the right answer the first time. And the other engineers at Hewlett-Packard were stunned. And I gave it to them. I gave them the calculator. I said, here's the equation. Just type it in from left to right. None of them could do it. They couldn't clear their mind out of the prior skills they had learned. And so sometimes when you have learned a skill of doing something one way, it's hard to notice a new way when it's simpler and causes you less thinking and does what technology should do. It's hard to, you don't want to give up the skills you've learned that make you what you are. Yeah. Pardon? Oh, here's what happened on the decimal point. After we came out with the Apple II, we had My Basic in it, and it had no decimal points in the numbers. Now, decimal points aren't beyond me. I actually, in the ROMs of the Apple II, I stuck in and I wrote an article for Byte magazine, what's called floating point routines. The routines that will add, subtract, multiply, and divide numbers with decimal points. So I could have easily stuck it in the language, given a little more time. Randy Wigington, a guy that I met, he was in high school at the Homebrew Computer Club. He and I were working on a new language with decimal points, floating point numbers. And somehow one day, while we were in the middle of working on it for a month or two, Microsoft came in the door and said they had one for the 6502. And I said, wow, if they have one, we don't have to do the work. And I analyzed it. I helped them. Bill Gates showed up, helped him put in some floppy disk routines, some color drawing routines, and some printout routines, and some of the special things that we had in an Apple II. And we got their base and just went with theirs. Unfortunately, we had a 5-year license, and when the license expired 5 years later, maybe 81, 82, I think, they had us over the cooker because that was all the revenues of the company just pouring in. It was just, a money-making machine, the Apple II. And all of a sudden, Microsoft kind of owned the key part of it. And we had to renew it. And I think that's where we licensed away the GUI that was involved. So I wish I had just put the floating point in from day one. The reason I left it out, I wanted to save 1 month on my basic writing time so I could be first at something. I was afraid that if I delayed, somebody would beat me and somebody else would be number one to have a basic for the 6502 microprocessor. That was the only reasoning. Too bad.
I'd like to get you to talk a little bit about the early distribution of the kind of computers you had. I need to tell you just a quick story of how I was involved in some of this. We had a successful web company in the area. We sold it like Pioneer Stereo. Pretty well recognized, my partner and I. And so we went down to meet with Mike Marco, and they were not looking for.
He had a successful rep company. He came down and met with Mike Barkala in the early days of our distribution.
I'll try and say everything here. He was not interested in a rep, he wanted a distributor. And there was some amount of money that would be given at the time, we had some other obligations. So my partner said, no, we can't do this. So a lot of money, we never did it.
So he and his partner turned down the Apple II because they didn't want to become distributors, just reps.
That's right. Well, of course, what happened is another guy, his name was Tom Biggin, became the distributor. And then within a year, he was a rep because he was converted from distributor to rep. You have to be very reps for about 3 years.
Oh, you're talking about sales, and I don't know anything about that.
Well, the thing is, the early people that you sold to were all dealers. Most of them came out of the hi-fi business, which is the business that we had been in. So we knew all those people, and we would have been able to sell to them.
Yeah, well, the early computer dealers, it was pretty amazing. Little stores would spring up with all their shelves empty. They didn't have agreements with a bunch of companies for products. All we had to do was have a good computer, and they wanted to put it on their shelves. My God, every time a store opened up in a new city, it was easy for any computer company to have product in there. It was a strange thing compared to today. You think, God, any company, if you wanted to sell something, every store already has all these agreements, and they like certain brands, and it's so hard to get in nowadays. It was a rare time.
The story is that after about 3 years of this, where 1 year as distributors and then 3 years as manufacturing reps, these guys made a lot of money.
Okay, thanks. I believe they made a lot of money. Yeah.
You were on the Mac team.
How come I was on the Mac team? I was on the Mac team. Here's what happened. We went down, Jeff Raskin came into Apple, and he's the one that trained Steve Jobs and I into making computers that even young kids would understand. If a young child understood it, you made a better computer because the computer expert can still use it, but everyone down to the young child could understand it. So he really brought the ease of use into Apple so much, and he was running the Macintosh project. But Steve Jobs, I noticed that all of my favorite people in Apple had gone over to this Macintosh project. They were the outsiders of the company. The guy who was designing the hardware was a technician who'd never even gone to college, but he looked at my design styles and he wanted to be another Wozniak designer, and he was, Burl Smith. Andy Hertzfeld, my great friend talking a lot of Dylan stories, was writing the software. Bill Atkinson, the greatest artist in Apple with his software. Every line of code, like my own, had to have a reason and make sense and be the most optimum. He was doing the graphics for the Lisa and the Macintosh. So I went over there. All my best friends were there. I went to the Macintosh division. I was designing the CPU. Then the 68000 came out from Motorola, and it was obviously the better way to go, one-chip microprocessor. And then I had a plane crash. And 5 weeks later, when I came out of an amnesia state, and I realized I hadn't been at work for 5 weeks, I really, Apple was able to go on without me. It didn't need one engineer doing everything anymore. I decided this was my last chance to go back to college and get my degree. Did that, put on some rock concerts called the US Festivals. And it's a little secret between you and I, there's another US Festival coming. I better not say when and where, but it might be local. Pretty soon. And it took some very top level Washington, D.C. approvals. But it's happening again. Anyway, I did that, and then I went back to Apple to contribute and work on where I could do the best, the Apple II. John Sculley joined us as a CEO at that time, and instantly realized the Apple III was losing money for the company. It's a story that I sometimes tell. We were putting every effort we could into the Apple III. Every single person at Apple had an Apple III on their desk because a few executives at the top had come up with the clever reason why this was the right machine. It came out of marketing thinking. In engineering, we were told to put extra chips in, extra money, to disable some features that people wanted. Because marketing had to have it right. When it was in an Apple II mode, we had to disable some features so they wouldn't think the Apple II could do what they wanted. So that was a strange time. The Apple III, we lost a lot of money as a company and didn't report it. Because you don't report salaries of everybody as attributed to a project like that way. So, I don't know. I know I've covered whatever. And I wound up finding out I could teach. I had great classes, a lot of fun, kept a lot of entertainment in my classes. I'm buying the programs kids liked, and lots of jokes were allowed. I was a voluntary teacher. So if I failed to teach something one day, say it was programming, some programming lesson, I'd go home sad. Teachers go home upset if the children didn't get it, the students didn't get it. But I could go back this next day and teach it again. Whereas a normal teacher in school has to move on to the next pages in the book every single day. I was very flexible that way. I had a great time. I did it for 8 years. 5th grade was my main class, but then I had advanced students that were beyond. They'd already gone through the main class. And I would teach 200 hours a year in each class. And I would teach teachers because I thought teachers were more important. They understood the computers the least, but a child in school, a student in school, will only come up to the level of performance that a teacher expects, for the most part. And boy, the kids, I had so many fun times teaching. The kids would teach me things, and the excitement they would have at learning every little thing, the early chat rooms on AOL, learning how to make their own computer a server. So their disk, Carly's disk will pop up on the classroom and other people will see it. Jeff's disk. And they were so proud of that. And then I let them, if anything wasn't protected on the network, you can mess it up and hide things all you want, as long as it can be brought back to what it was, easily. And they obeyed that rule for 8 years. Every once in a while, one girl would say, "Steve, my control panel's disappeared." And I'd look around and there's little Daniel typing and smiling. No, the classes were, just an immense amount of fun, and it's fun. A lot of the kids have graduated from college now, and I just go and I feel so proud. Even a little story, I did not teach computer science like computer, you got to learn ones and zeros. I taught every person, what can I teach that applies to every single person here? How to make your homework look good was the main subject. How to maintain a computer when everything in the world crashes and fails and you have to reinstall. How to do that is the next part. How does memory work? How do networks work? They had to identify packets and how they would flow on networks, because otherwise you can't understand when a lot of things go wrong. And the internet was just in its early days. I was so proud. I got into the internet in its earliest days. Steve Jobs was at my father's memorial, and he talked about how he had gotten a T1 line extended from Stanford to his house. So wow, I started looking into it and found out how to get a T1 line, and I was so scared. I didn't know what words, how do you set up these things called routers, how do you set up Sun servers to be email and everything, and did it and lucked out and got some things going, but I got the domain, a 3-letter domain, woz.com. And you know what? I'm not a commercial person at heart, so I never used woz.com. I only used woz.org. Because I kind of align myself more with the nonprofits that I've been associated with and on so many boards of. So I forget what the question was, but I hope I hit it. Hi there.
After iPhone, what does Apple have coming up in the pipeline?
What does Apple have coming up in the pipeline? You know that we're never allowed to talk about that. There's an iPhone coming up. You know that. You know what? Actually, I have to tell you the truth. A long time ago, I could get anything I wanted from inside of Apple, both information and products. And I stopped wanting to ever get these advanced products that were in beta form. Something wouldn't work, and I'd call them, and they'd say, "Yeah, bring it down and we'll update it for you. We have a fix on that." I got tired of going back and forth to get things fixed. So, you know, I'm sort of out of Apple, but I don't want early stuff. I just want it once it's shipped to 1 million people and I have it. Also, I found out people inside of Apple don't know the real world. I like to know the real world. I'm a genuineness type person. If you go into a store every week and you're buying the latest stuff and testing it, you know what works, what doesn't, what's for sale, what isn't for sale, what's not shipping, which models are shipping and which aren't. And all the people inside the company just think everything is just what they say. And so I'm a lot smarter than the ones in the company that way. Over time, I don't take advantage very often of my employee discounts, the big ones I get inside the company. I'll go down to the Valley Fair store and get my 10% discount. I got a friend who's on an advisory, Santa Clara County Sheriff's Advisory Board. He has a badge. He goes into, that badge gets him into every movie at every Century Theater anytime he wants. And he goes to the Apple store and he gets 17% discount. And as an employee, I get 10%. But yeah, I do that. I'm gonna line up as soon as the mall opens on the 29th. I'm gonna get in line for an iPhone that way. Even though Steve Jobs called me and said he's sending me one, I know that it arrives on Saturday the next day. But I have kids. I want to kind of cover my kids. If they have a limit of 1 or 2 per person, it'll be worth it. Regrets about what? No, I have no regrets. Everything I did, I know the reasons that I did them were so good back then. Every project I ever worked on was an A+ project. The only regret I've come up with is maybe I should have taken the extra month and put the floating point in the basic back then. And everything, it was very strange though. I was writing programs in a different way than anyone's ever written programs, which is you type a program into a computer, right? Whether you're typing it in C, or you're typing assembly language, or you're typing BASIC, or Fortran, you're typing it into a computer. I couldn't afford the computer system. You sign up for time sharing in those days. I couldn't afford it. So what I did was I wrote my programs on one side of a piece of paper, looked at a card, and I wrote down the ones and zeros that it would make on the other side, and I typed the ones and zeros in myself. Every bit of the Apple II code is handwritten. There's never been a computer, never been a big piece of code ever developed that way. Only tiny ones. So that's actually going to be my second book. It's going to be a manuscript, the handwritten manuscript with explanations from me. I've gotten sort of, time is really weird. I had a lot of free time, and I did the philanthropy, and I did the teaching, and my last kid now graduated high school a couple years ago. So here I am in a big, huge house, all alone, no kids there, and I just had to look for things to do. Boy, did I get busy. I found out you can be more busy, you never get home but for 2 days at a time. I'm always traveling, speaking to all these groups that want me. I'm participating on a lot of advisory boards for engineering colleges, getting awards, doing everything. So busy. I had time to write a book. I wrote a book in that time. I put that book off for 20 years, and it was just so fun. The publishers wanted it in my voice. So instead of writing the book, I spoke it into a tape recorder. We got transcripts and just had to edit it into place and then go back through to make sure it sounded like me. It's full of errors, but that's because I was kind of lazy, didn't have all the time in the world. Oh God, I've done so much. Started a new company with a couple of Apple executives, Gil Emilio and all that. And we make semiconductors now in Southern California. I got a whole ton of projects I'm working on. I can't even talk about them. Companies. I'll talk about one that I'd love to do since it's not begun anywhere yet. I want to build a globe out of a display. Now they're making this display material you can fold. I want to make a real display that is in a globe, and it displays Google Earth on a real globe, and ways that you can click and start zooming in and seeing features, and also seeing where the webcams are, little blue dots, and go check out a webcam over here in Africa and see what's at the water hole. So I'd love to do that. Yeah.
Whatever happened that Apple never got as a real input voice? You know, via voice imported from IBM.
Yeah, Apple never got a good enough voice recognition for like transcription. You know, you talk into a microphone and get it onto your screen. Well, David Pogue of the New York Times would tell you that he does that, but he has to go use the Dragon software on a PC. And we never got it good enough on the Apple, and on the Macintoshes, and I don't know why. Voice recognition, part of the reason is because for 50 years we've talked about steps forward in artificial intelligence. As far as I'm concerned, we've never done diddly squat one. We have a little demonstration that claims to be artificial intelligence, claims to be like a mind would work, but we don't have one. I can talk to you in a noisy room. I could talk to my TV set in a noisy room, to you, and I'd say, television channel up, and you'd hear what I said, and you'd figure it out. Television can't do that. The best we can do is with a microphone right by our mouth, under the optimal situations with a lot of quiet, you know, and even then, they don't do it very well because we don't know how the brain works. You know, when it comes to voice, look what a brain does. It listens knowing that syllables come in sort of a regular beat pattern, and the brain sort of is anticipating that. We know how if a sentence starts, you know how it might end. You know, I'm going to the movies at 8 o'clock. You're already anticipating a time. Your brain's thinking ahead a little. And we have, you know, ways of filtering frequencies. All these are done independently by research scientists, but they never combine a whole thing. One example I like to use is, we'll never have a robot that makes a cup of coffee. Will we? I could go into your house and I might be able to make a cup of coffee. You could go into my house and you could probably make a cup of coffee. But you know, a lot of that comes from the fact that you lived a lot of lives making cups of coffee yourself on different machines, seeing other people do it, learning things, learning what words might stand, what abbreviations might stand for what, trying to find pieces that fit into various places of a machine. To have a robot like that, I think, would have to go through a real human learning experience. Just like creating art. You can write a program that computers create a bunch of music that follows certain patterns that sort of sounds like good music. But it's not like art. A real musician has to judge what he has. Well, now you write a program that says, I'll create some music and I'll judge the good ones and pass the good ones on. But the trouble is, we humans, you know, base how music sounds or some words in a song, we base it on our own lives that we've led, things that have happened to us, you know, girlfriends we've had, everything. So a computer hasn't had those things. So it's really difficult to replace a lot of things that seem very common on the human level with a computer. But yeah, as far as speaking into the microphone, I wish we had it on the Macintosh. It would be so popular.
Oh, I was just wondering, what's the next evolution? You know, you went from GUI to GUI. What's the next step?
What's the next step beyond GUI? I get asked that a lot. People want to say, what is the new interaction of humans with computers? You know, is it thinking, is it touch, is it speech, and this and that? And I think it's going to be the same as it's always been. It's been, you know what, the basic interaction has been a keyboard for 50 years. And you'll be surprised, but 50 years ago, well, actually, go back to 1963. Today's GUI machines were actually described that long ago in a paper by Douglas Engelbart. Mouses, cursors, menus, windows popping up. Before TV, you could ever imagine a TV screen could be affordable. You go back further in time, and they were digitizing tablets where they had to digitize electronic projects, you know, way back, even in the 50s maybe. They'd click buttons on this little device. It was just so much like a mouse. So it's not like we've really advanced that far in technology and user interface. And everything boils down pretty much to the keyboard from computers from day one. So why would I say, oh, wow, in the next step, we're going to replace keyboards with something more advanced? I'm just too much an engineer, and I don't see it. You know, also, big revolutions like that, you never see them in advance. If everyone saw them, there's 1 million financial investors brighter than us, and they would all be making Googles of money, you know, seeing what's coming. So I can't give you a good futurist. I don't like to talk the futurist stuff, because anybody, you know, it's great. I could say anything I want, because I'll never be around to be judged when it later. They'll forget it.
So I have kind of a technical question, but I understand that the Apple III had some hardware problems.
The Apple III had her hardware problems horrendous. We made tiny traces for its day that between 2 pins of an IC, we'd run a trace between them, tiny traces, and they broke. You could bend the board and they'd make connections, and it was horrible. So the dealers, if you're a dealer, like my brother was, you sell an Apple III and it comes back and it can't be fixed. And then Apple can't fix it. You stop selling that product right away. Yeah, so the Apple III was dead at the start. It had a bad name. A year later, we fixed the problems, but you can't revive a name that's already dead. Never got revived. We should have called the Apple IV when we reintroduced it and made some bigger changes.
I'm an editor, and I wonder why computers can't tell a difference between when you use K and when you use can. And because they can't, people say things like a apple.
People say computers sometimes, I guess, say things like a apple instead of an apple. Why not? I think there's better examples where some things start with, well, at least with Y, or some things start, I think, with a a vowel, but you have to use a, or vice versa. There are a few examples in English that way too. I don't know why computers can't. It would seem to me like it's an English. I thought we always did it correctly. That's a simple, simple rule. You know, what follows? Yeah, what follows? Do you use a or un? You know, an apple, an orange, a banana. What's the problem? That's the easy rule, I thought. I mean, English is so bad. The problem with English is, you know, yeah, what is a word? How do you spell it? I love Spanish. I love Spanish. If you can pronounce a word, there's only one spelling. If you spell it, there's only one pronunciation. Yeah. One more question, and then we'll do some book signing, and I'll be around to talk to people individually after that. Door prizes. Okay, door prizes before the book signing. Okay, one more question.
What advice do you have for the young people in the crowd?
What advice do I have for the people in the crowd? Younger people, well, always follow your heart. Know what you want to do in life, what you would like to change and make really good. And even if it doesn't seem to have much value today, that's the direction you should follow, and not, your life shouldn't be a plan. I think it should be very creative. Creativity is where a lot of the greatness comes from. Some countries, you know, everybody has to follow very strict rules, like Singapore. And where are the great writers? Where are the musicians? Where's the popular music? Where are the great athletes? They don't come from Singapore. A country the same size, New Zealand, is full of those. It's just, you know, how you basically, I'm for creativity and for a lot of free thinking and not having strict rules. You can only follow one path in life. Thanks very much. Good talking.
So, if you would be so kind to.
Oh, good. So I get to do this.
And just.
Okay. Steve Wozniak. I got it. Okay. Lonnie Silva.
All right. This.
Oh, we're going to do a whole bunch of them. Good.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not looking. Jeff Morris. Oh my gosh. So you're all going to come up later, I guess?
Well, keep on coming. I'll start handing over.
Karen Vifian? Sounded like we got one. Alan Baranagra? Is that right? I'm not very good at...
You want to help?
Art Langhorst. Art Langhorst. Do we have Art here? Looks, maybe. I always have this thought that I'll get the more random one if I just take a longer time. Chab Getrusis?
Okay.
Okay.
Almost there. Oh, they are getting a $25 gift card for the Apple Store.
Kathleen Buffleben? We've got 5 more to go. Ann Pfaffdoss?
All right.
Is that close?
Close enough. Okay.
With a name like Wozniak, I'm okay with slight mispronunciations. Joyce Wong.
All right. I want the card.
Yeah, somebody might have left, and then we'll have an extra. Chris Bleschley?
Collecting the card back.
Yeah. Jamie, let me read that. Rosemsky?
Rodemsky.
Rodemsky?
Uh-huh.
Okay, here he comes.
Here. The last one.
One more. I remember how I cheated once at one of these. Well, the person next to me won it, and I was visiting a club in Detroit. I told her, if you win, pass it to me and don't claim it. She passed it to me, and I claimed to be the winner. They gave me a piece of software, Jay Sears.
Thank you.